Well, folks, it is another episode of the Leaders of Leaders podcast, and I have the incredible pleasure and great honor to have Paul Granger on here. He has a shepherding and pastoral gifting, which gives him the unique ability to cultivate rich dialogue and process the difficult questions of life. Maybe just stop right there and jump right in, because obviously he's got a ton of stories, and he talks about God is God and God is good no matter the circumstance. But I'm just innately curious as to how this kind of perspective and worldview came about. And clearly, everybody who's on this podcast has a Christ-centered worldview, disciple in Christ in some way, shape, or form. But it's so interesting to me how every human is going to see things a little bit different. And so we get to kind of see new facets of not only the Christian walk, but people's relationship with Christ. So yeah, Paul, what kind of shifted you into this? I would say definitely non-societal, because the societal norms we were kind of talking about that are that, we have stuff and we have money, and that's kind of what makes us. And if you don't have money and cool looking things and you don't look good, then you suck. And obviously that's very general, ambiguous version of it, and maybe a little bit negative, but kind of unfortunately you see the marketing and all that stuff. What kind of brought you into this mindset and into this worldview?
Yeah. So, interestingly, I've actually been serving in ministries for almost 2 decades now. And, I developed a deeper relationship with God when I was in middle school. I grew up in the church, baptized as an infant, the whole deal. But it wasn't until middle school or so that I realized, I wonder if being a Christian isn't just that you go to church. Maybe I should actually think about what this means in my life and in my decisions. And that was the start of cultivating personal.
And that was in junior high?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so going into high school, it started to deepen. And by the time I was looking into college, I felt this sense that I wanted to do something with ministry. I had very little understanding of what that could include. So it was like pastor or missionary. Those are the only two things I was thinking of. So I went to a Christian university, ended up feeling like I wasn't supposed to be in behind the pulpit pastor, but graduated and found myself serving with a ministry called Urban Promise. And it was in that space that I was introduced to a very different way of living, because this was a group of people that were basically serving full time. And when I say full time, I mean like full, all of their time, not just 40 hours, but living in the community they were serving day in and day out, weekends and so forth, exploring what healthy boundaries look like, but also having a willingness. If a neighborhood kid rang the doorbell, would they be willing to get up off the sofa and go down? And so for 2 years, I was able to be in this space of seeing this is a group of people that aren't doing this for money, that aren't doing this for acclaim, that aren't doing this for any of the normal, as you mentioned, societal goals. They were doing it because they felt an invitation from God. There's one guy that I just love him. He was often talking about how he wasn't there because he wanted to be. He's like, I don't even want to be here, but God hasn't said I could leave yet. So, and he didn't mean it in a negative way, but he was trying to emphasize like, he's here because of God's invitation. This isn't something that he would have chosen, but he's still willing. And so, man, that planted a seed. I don't know if I mentioned the name, Urban Promise Ministries in Wilmington, Delaware, planted this beautiful seed that in the years since then, I left there 2006. I found myself exploring what that actually means for me long-term. And since 2007, 2008, I've been serving in the same community. There's this entity, CCDA, Christian Community Development Association. And the first introduction I had to that was around 2006 or so. And this is a group of people who are exploring what does it mean to represent Christ in urban contexts, to build community, to find the thriving of communities. And one of the things they said, now I've forgotten a lot of stuff they said in 2006, but one thing they said really stood out to me. And the guy said something to the effect of, if you really want to see the depth of impact that God's inviting us to, you need to be willing to commit long-term, 15, 20 years. And again, they're talking about community development. So there is a place for coming into a space and then leaving that space. I mean, we see the Apostle Paul doing it all the time. But this was a different form of ministry. This was, am I willing to stay at the table long-term? I mean, functionally, you're seeing a kid go from kid to graduate in that space of time. You're seeing them develop and be raised up. And that really sat with me. And so, as I mentioned, I've been in the same community, but it's been interesting seeing, even in that, even serving alongside people, we're all coming to the table still with these different goals, different expectations, different values. And particularly when it comes to ministry, that's something I've been thinking about a lot, because we want to believe that the goal of ministry is to honor God and to serve God and to love others, to love God and love others. Realistically, many ministries, nonprofits, even churches are operating in a societal context that has values around money, that has values around reputation, that has values around these different things, and sometimes can feel a pressure to align with that. So that could take the form of, man, we'd love to do this kind of thing, but we just don't have the money for that, so we can't do it. Or we'd love to do this thing, but there are people that are supporting us that wouldn't like that, so we can't do that, right? We're starting to make decisions around that. And so this happens on big levels, but also individual levels. And so really the short answer to your question of what brought me to the place where I am now, where for over 4 years, I haven't gotten a traditional paycheck. For over 4 years, every year has seemed to be a little different. I've had to hold things loosely because of what God's invited me to has been shifting and changing, partly because of a pandemic, but also many other factors. Like, it's a very untraditional life, not a life I would have chosen, not a life I would have felt like I could have chosen. But the reason I found myself in that is because I unexpectedly lost my job in an unjust way. But God gave me a heads up about it in a really supernatural and beautiful way, and gave me a peace about trusting him. When I feared what people would think of me if I was unemployed, because as you mentioned, that's, you look down on if you don't have a sustainable job. God said, don't be afraid of that. When I was thinking, man, at the time, my wife was pregnant with our third child. So like, I've got to have it. You have to have money. You have to. And God's like, no, you don't have to have money. You need me as provider. I may provide through money. I may provide in other ways, but what you actually need is me. So don't have financial fear. Trust in me. This loss of this job in an unjust way actually propelled me into being able to step more deeply into this foolishness of God, of choosing to follow God's footsteps in a way that was untraditional, foolish, seemingly risky. And man, I was just thinking about it today. We are actually in a healthier financial place than we were when my wife and I both had full-time jobs. I'm not saying like we're rolling in the money, but I haven't felt financial fear, right, in 4 years. I mean, how often can we say that in life? I mean, so often in life, we are afraid like, will I have enough for this? Will I have enough for this? I haven't felt financial fear, and I've not gotten a traditional paycheck. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of factors that have brought me to this place, but really the core of it is way back in high school. I God had positioned me in a place to be able to say, all right, God, I want to go where you tell me to go. Did I know where that was going to be? Nope. But that willingness to step into that unknown has brought me to this place now where I wouldn't trade it, man.
So I'm certain there are people, and probably not everybody, but people that are listening and are like, well, okay, then what do I do? What's the formula for, living a life? It's so interesting because so many pastors from the pulpit, so many missionaries, on their mission, so many ministers in their ministry will say like, oh, live a life fully sold out to Christ, where Christ is truly your Lord in every area and aspect. But I would be curious as to, pick apart their life and see how well that's being walked out. And most people, if they're honest with themselves, will think and be like, man, I don't think I've given that to God. I don't think I've let Christ have this part of my life. And I don't think And so it's really interesting when you say that. And actually, before I close with that question, I do want to say something that I have said often is, and I just, in observation, I don't know where I read it or where I saw it or how I learned it, but you hit it when you were talking. If you actually want to see growth, you got to be in it for the long haul. And so the saying for me is, we overestimate what we can get done in an hour, in a day, in a week, and in a month, but we underestimate what we can do in a year and in a decade. And I think that you said that really well. And it's so true. I mean, if you really want to see, not just in communities, but in an individual, whether it's, something big, something small, if you really want to see impact, you got to invest in the long haul, invest yourself in the long haul. And this is in anything, right? Like, it could be playing the cello. And I don't know if you play the cello or if it's just beautifully set
right,
that blue background.
That's my instrument, man. Can't play it often because it's not a solo instrument, but it's pretty.
It is really pretty, and it looks good with that blue. But sports, and then most definitely, I think, in our relationship with Christ, and any relationship, really, it's like our relationship with ourselves, as we invest in that over time, our relationship with our loved ones, spouse, children, friends, teams, whatever it might be. We'll see a little bit of impact, and maybe suddenly in that sort of Apostle Paul way, where it's like, boom, you go there, and then you're sending letters and corresponding and communicating, but nothing like if you're actually there with the people walking out. And I mean, Jesus Christ did that 3 solid years, with his 12 disciples. So so the question is, I'm guessing there is no formula, but what is for those people that are like, is there a way where I could just do this 4-year journey that I'm hearing Paul Granger tell me about? Like, but do I have to get fired unjustly from the job? Or and sometimes things like that do create that worldview shift, that, paradigm shift in our minds, where it's like, oh, okay, God, you go. But is there something that you can, I don't know, share or tell that might help those of us that are, I don't know, pretty secure here?
Good news is, here's the 3-step formula in my right.
Exactly.
But I mean, that's how we are, right? We want it to be prescriptive, and I think that's understandable, right? Because it's a big ask. Like, God's inviting us to follow him, and he's inviting us to follow him with our whole life. And it's like, all right, but what does that functioning look like? Especially if I have bills to pay, if I have mouths to feed, how do I do that? And, one thing that I find myself often coming back to is, how can we make these invitations and truths accessible no matter where somebody is, whether they have a seminary degree or they haven't touched their Bible in a year? How can this be accessible? And I think one of the first simple steps is humble introspection. Like, just stepping back and saying, what is it that I'm actually after here? Like, what is it that I think I'm supposed to be after? Like, what is it that I am desiring? What is it I'm assuming about God? Like, just sit and process some of these things, because we'll do broad sweeps and we'll run towards that. So we'll do the broad sweep of, I have to have a job, and I have to do this, and I have to do this, and won't stop to consider if God's saying, but what if I want to do something a little different, right? And so when we stop and we do some humble introspection, we can find out sometimes our motives, even we could be well-intentioned and actually, as you noted before, desire to seek God, but our motives could actually be driven more by societal pressure, or by fear, or by desires like reputation or wealth, and sometimes these things aren't bad things. I just realized my cat's over here cleaning herself. I mean, for those watching on video, that's the Easter egg. You got to have it in there.
I saw the cat come up earlier, and I was like, Oh, that's cool. This is the second podcast in a row where somebody's pet is like, I just want to hang out with you guys right now.
And who knows, the cat may have good advice, and are we listening? But it's sometimes we have legitimate, valid reasons. Sometimes it's logical things. As I mentioned, I lost my job unexpectedly, unjustly, and I had 2 kids, a wife, and a baby on the way. Like logically, I should have rushed to get a job, because otherwise I'm being irresponsible, aren't I? Because this stuff costs money. You only get money from a job. But God had brought me to this place of humble introspection. One of those pieces, for example, was coming to understand what my job actually was. So this was a really difficult work environment that I was in for a number of years. It was just very hard. I wanted to leave year after year after year. And I would pray and seek God, and I would say, God, can I please leave? Because this is tearing me apart. And God didn't force me or anything like that, but I had this sense that God was inviting me to stay. In fact, sometimes it felt like the invitation was, Paul, I want to invite you to stay, and it's going to get harder, right?
Ugh.
Logically, comfort, being respected, having a sustainable job, those are the things that make sense. And staying in a hard work environment where I'm insulted and degraded, and the scope of the job is becoming unattainable. But God was inviting me to stay. And in my last year there, I had a meeting with the person I was supervising at the time, was being accused of things that not only did I not do, but he had actually done, was attributing to me. And I got to a place where I'm like, well, this is hopeless. Like, if he's accusing me of things that are actually on his hands, like, what hope is there for me? If I'm God, I can't, I don't know, God. I don't know how this is going to work. And spiritual father of mine happened to be we had 2 hard meetings, was in the second meeting. And he's like, Paul, you don't work for this person. You don't work for this organization. You work for God. So what is your boss, God, telling you to do? And I'm like, I feel like he's inviting me to stay. But if I stay, and I'm going into all the excuses and reasons, he's like, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. What is God telling you to do? And it was this moment of recognizing that I had been in the mindset that my job was working for this ministry, this job title, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No. My job was ambassador of Christ. I mean, the moment that I signed on to follow Jesus, that's my primary job. I have these secondary responsibilities if I'm working in a formal job, but my primary job is ambassador of Christ. And that can sometimes call me into places that may counter this other job, right? Peter, his primary job was fisherman. Jesus said, I want to invite you to do something else. In fact, he did this after Peter had his best catch ever because of Jesus, right? But Peter had his best catch ever. So much fish, the boats are sinking. He could have, in his human logic, said, well, I can't leave now. Like, I've stumbled onto something great. Like, man, the money I can make from this. But Jesus was inviting him to a different role, to be a fisher of men, which ended up necessitating him stepping away from everything he knew, stepping into places that he didn't know, stepping into invitations that would be costly, reputation, financially, his own life, right? And so, like, when we have humble introspection, we can actually stop to say, well, what is it that I'm actually chasing after here? Is it the life that I desire, the life that's expected of me? Is it my comfort? Is it my security? Is it this, that, or the other? Or am I actually trying to follow Jesus? Because, and this is the hard part, we can, again, be well-intentioned, genuinely desire to want to follow Jesus. But the question that Jesus often asks is, but how far are you willing to follow? It's nice that you want to follow me for these easy parts. It's nice that you want to follow me for these slightly hard parts, but I'm going to death. So are you willing to follow me that far? John 6:66 describes how many of them didn't. It says Jesus was talking about his death, talking about eating his body and drinking his blood. And that was the line. Like, we often have a line, and that was theirs. I'm not going any further, Jesus.
I'm out of here.
Yep, I'm out of this. You even got examples like Peter, though, because Peter, I think he authentically would have been willing to die for Jesus under certain parameters. You see it in the garden, right? The guards are coming. Peter pulls out his sword, right? He's going to die at that point. one man with a sword's not going to beat all these guards, right? He is legitimately willing to die. But then when he's by this fire and this girl saying, wait, weren't you with Jesus? Oh, I don't know Jesus, right? He wasn't willing to die in that point because he had a line. I'm willing to go down in a blaze of glory, but to be dragged and beaten and mocked and spit on, I can't do that. He had a line. And so are we willing to be humble enough to own that stuff? And this is the good news. Jesus has a grace for us in that because he knows that we have our lines. He knows that we have limited capacity. He knows there is a point at which we do not believe we can step any further. And he is willing to meet us in that space. If we're willing to own that, like he did with Peter, look, Peter, you're going to deny me. No, never. I will never do that. But Jesus is right there willing to take his hand and say, do you love me? So humble introspection can help us to see our limitations and our weaknesses, our goals that might not be in alignment with Jesus's, and then to be able to accept Jesus's grace and guidance and love to step where we never would have stepped. We never could have stepped. We never should have stepped from a human standpoint to find the full life that he was promising all along.
All right. So Jesus meets us in our limitations. I love that. And then this humble introspection. I do want to get to, we might nerd out on this for a little bit too long, which I'm okay with as well, but
let's do it.
But I do want to get to what are the difficult questions of life and then kind of wrap on that, which might open us up for having to do a whole other podcast another time, which I'm okay with as well. But so when somebody's humbly in introspection, are you thinking they're just thinking about how they're receiving Christ, or do you think that it's our relationship with Christ? Or is it just us, like, and where kind of we're sitting, like, you see what I'm saying? Because if we have, let's say, we are followers of Christ, we are disciples of Christ, we have the indwelling life of Christ through the Holy Spirit, right? Guiding us, convicting us, all of these things. We got God the Father guiding us, directing us. And so we're in communion with the triune God. But introspection typically, right? It's like I'm thinking about myself and how I'm interacting, and so is it how we're interacting with God and or with his vision, how we're being maybe selfish and yes, or are we actually introspecting in communion with the triune God through the Holy Spirit? I'm just curious. We could parse that apart a little bit, because I love it. I think it's absolutely right on.
Yeah. Well, I think in our humanity, we always end up starting off with the, like, how does this impact me? And what's this about for me? And who, but the opportunity is, the more we press into that, the more we can extend beyond ourselves. Because if we look at the whole of Scripture, you get stories of individuals, but their role in God's story is bigger than their individual life. I mean, Hebrews 11 is all about a group of people who didn't even get the thing that was promised, right? That were stepping into obedience and never got to see it because it was about something bigger than them. I mean, generations beyond them. And this is why people struggled even with Jesus's story, because the disciples believed that his purpose was to lead them to freedom, right? And Jesus was like, yes, but it's bigger than you realize. And because their understanding of freedom was around Jesus being built up in authority and power and in strength, and then taking control, when he did the opposite and allowed himself to be insulted and eventually beaten and eventually killed, it made no sense. Now, Jesus frequently did humble introspection, frequently went and spent time with his Father, aligned what he did with what he saw his Father doing. I only do what I see my Father doing, even at the expense of his own desires. He's in the garden. He's like, if there is any way for this cup to be taken from me, can we do that? But not my will, but yours be done. He was willing to endure the most excruciating suffering that has ever existed on earth,
Mm.
right? None of us will ever know the depth of that suffering. And he did it because he knew it was about something bigger than just himself and his own plans. It was about what his Father was doing. And so in the same way, I think when we do humble introspection, and what I mean by that too is it's not just that we're doing some self-thinking and self-actualization. It's deeper than that. Humble introspection is acknowledging, all right, God, I am humbly positioning myself before you
Yeah.
in case there's something you want to tell me or show me or reveal to me. It's, am I willing to not just think about what I want, but to say, I'm putting myself in the hot seat before God. And over time doing that, God will reveal things. God will reveal to us. Sometimes it's through situations we begin to find the selfishness that we had been operating in, or the drive that was towards the wrong thing, or these little pieces. And the more we come back to the table humbly, God can show us how this is bigger and bigger and bigger than us, bigger than our own lives. And so I think it's a little bit of each. I think God does invite us to see what he's doing in our individual stories. But because it's so much bigger, that's the real opportunity, is when we realize, oh, actually, it doesn't matter if I have or lose my job, or it doesn't matter if this, that, or the other happens, because God is actually in control. Take the Apostle Paul, right? On the best trajectory of life from his vantage point. Pharisee of Pharisees, Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, blameless. Like, he was on track to be the best of the best. And then Jesus says, hey, we'll get you to do a little humble introspection on this road to Damascus. And he ended up spending some years really processing who he was and what he was at. He knew the scriptures, by the way. He knew the scriptures intimately. Yeah. And he had to spend this time processing, wow, I thought I understood the scriptures in God. And then the Son of God confronted me and said, why are you persecuting me? And I realized, oh my goodness, I've been persecuting the Son of the one that I sought to serve. And then his trajectory of life goes a completely different direction, like from the one persecuting to the one being persecuted. But this is what's so wild, is he had to realize that it was so much not about his own life, that there is a point, and I love this, and it's like late Acts, maybe 17. The Apostle Paul has got a sense from the Holy Spirit that he is to go to Jerusalem and he's going to be persecuted, and eventually he's going to get killed, right? And he has been cultivating this ability to humbly come before the Spirit and say, all right, where should I go next? Like, all right, let's go to, throughout Asia. And then the Holy Spirit's like, nope, I want you to go to Macedonia. And he's willing to, like, all right, I had my plans. I'm going to drop them. We're going to go over here where I don't know anybody, but we'll see what happens, right? And so he gets this sense that he's supposed to go to Jerusalem and he's going to get killed, right? Meanwhile, the Spirit's speaking to other people that he loves and that love him. And there's this group, he's doing this like farewell tour. And they had this intervention for him. Like, they all gather around, including Luke. They're all his travel companions. Everyone's like, look, Paul, the Spirit's talked to us, and the Spirit's saying, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to die. So you can't go to Jerusalem. So I think they both authentically heard from the Spirit. But what was different? Well, Paul had done enough humble introspection to realize, if I die, it's not about me. So, like, if God invites me to die, then so be it, because this is about, it's better to be like, die and be with Christ, Yeah. Now, the other people, good intentions. Beautiful intentions. Their response was out of a deep, deep love for Paul. Like, we do not want Paul to die. Their response was out of a really solid logic. If Paul is arrested and killed, he can't continue to do his ministry that has been so beautifully effective. Like, so he can't be arrested. He can't be killed. And so they heard the same word from the Spirit, but interpreted it differently, because Paul's coming from humble introspection. The others are coming from great, beautiful intentions, but they aren't fully aligned with what the Spirit was inviting. And they cannot convince Paul. And finally they concede, and they're like, all right, he's stubborn. So we're going to weep. We're going to send him off. And sure enough, he gets captured, right? He gets sent off to Rome and eventually gets killed. But this awesome thing happens where he's writing out from his house arrest, and people are lamenting. He's like, look, the gospel is spreading a whole lot more with me here in prison than it was out there. People are being inspired and equipped that weren't otherwise. I am getting access to people that I couldn't have otherwise. The King Agrippa or whoever, right? Like Paul realizes that even if he couldn't have seen it on the front end, he knew that God could work through whatever crazy plan God concocted. And sure enough, he's in prison and seeing the gospel thrive, right? And so it's an individual thing, but it's also a bigger thing, but it is a journey. And if we operate as we often do, where we want the prescriptive answer now, we want to know now, we want to figure this out now, we're going to be frustrated most of the time, because it took time for Peter to grasp what Jesus had been saying all along. John 13:7 captures a sentiment that Jesus probably felt often, where he's trying to express serving and love to them, and they're not getting it. And 13:7 says, right now you do not understand what I'm doing, but later you'll understand.
Yeah.
Right? How often he must have felt that. You hear it when he's telling parables. He's like, how do y'all not get this? Come on, guys. Like, but he knew it's going to take time. And the Apostle Paul is the same way. It was going to take time, but eventually they came to see more deeply. You know, I see now as in a mirror looking dimly, but then I see clearly, like, and it's going to be true for us. And the best thing we can do after that humble introspection is then be willing to step into the dimness, into the vagueness, into the unknown, into the risk, because we're not stepping towards our goals. We're not stepping towards our confidence. We're stepping towards Jesus. Even if it's just a vague resemblance, we're stepping towards it because our goal is to be closer to him, not these other things.
Yeah. So you felt a little bit of what Jesus felt, being unjustly accused of something and then sent to, do something somewhere else. Like, hey, you just can't, you just can't be here. And it's interesting. I find that that's a really solid meditation point, is thinking about not just, and you were kind of paying a little homage to this, but not just the amount of suffering physically that's happening, but think about all of the emotional suffering and the unjustness of a blameless man taking on, fully man, fully God as well, but fully man in this moment, feeling all the feelings that we feel, not only physically, but emotionally as well, where he's feeling all of the sin of the world, right? Past and present and future, and willingly taking that on. But man, who wouldn't was at least say, can I not have this cup? Can I not get this? Is there a way? No, there isn't. Okay. Your will, I'll do that. And we were talking about that a little bit in our men's group, this idea of like fully man and fully God. And it was sort of like a sticking point, which leads me to, one of the things that you're willing to talk about and that you actually look forward to doing. And it's talking about the difficult questions of life. But then my thought is, okay, what are from your perspective, obviously, but what are the difficult questions of life? Because, I could think of a few, but they would be my versions of it. And I would love to know from you, what do you find as the difficult questions? And I would love to hear your perspective on how do you go about, whether it's stumbling and kind of mumbling your way through, or, really pouring over whatever it might be and studying and really trying to discover and own and understand what we can understand, at least, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's this core element where there's something that isn't straightforward, something that doesn't make sense, and it's paired with our sense that we deserve to know what the answer is to this. We deserve an explanation. You take Job, for example. He had some hard questions to ask of God, but he had this sense that God owes me an explanation, right? He needs to be able to explain to me why he allowed all this to happen. And spoiler, God doesn't. Like, God doesn't. His answer is, did you create any of these things? Like, are you even going to be able to comprehend if I did give you an answer?
Are you God? I didn't think so.
Right. And often in scripture, we see that from him. He says, I am. Like, that is his answer. And that actually is enough. But the questions that are difficult in life are so difficult because we haven't yet come to a peace with that reality.
Yeah.
That sometimes God's saying, I am is the answer. For parents, for anyone who's a parent that's listening, you know this reality in terms of when your kid asks for an explanation and you say something to the effect of, because I'm the parent or because I said so. Like when we're kids, we hated that because that seems unjust and unfair and makes no sense to us. You owe me an explanation. But when you're a parent, you're like, oh, I get it now. Like I don't actually owe my child an explanation. Or if I explained it to them, they wouldn't be able to comprehend it because they don't understand the circumstances around this, or, you know, any number of reasons. And so we have these things in our lives that seem unfair or seem unjust or seem confusing. And we want an explanation. And I think one of the biggest ones is the one you mentioned. And it's actually something that I've been sitting in since like February. My current season of my podcast is focused on sitting in suffering. Those moments where we've been trying to seek God, hardship hits, God doesn't take it away. And yet somehow we still learn that we can trust him. And I did not plan to do this season. I did not want to do this season because my last season was focused on healing. I didn't want to do that one either. I was like, I'm going to do one episode on healing. I felt like God was saying to do more. I'm like, oh, all right, God. Healing is controversial and confusing, and I didn't want to get into all that. But I said, all right, God, I'll step in. 51 episodes.
Jeez.
51 episodes. And I almost matched in a few months what I had recorded in the 3 years prior. So at the end of that, I was like, I'm good. I'm taking a break. And God's like, yeah, but what if? And through a series of events, a friend of mine connected with me, said, hey, I feel like God's invited me to share my story. Are you willing? I was like, well, I can record you. I don't know when it'll release because I'm taking a break. And 10 minutes into the episode, I'm like, dang it. I think God's invited me to do a season focused on sitting in suffering, which is so exciting and inspiring, right? Like suffering is one of those feel-good topics. But let me tell you, these have been amazing, beautiful conversations. Like it's such a hard topic. And yet there's a hope that has come through it. And I think the reason is yes, the question of suffering is, I mean, for generations has been one of the big hard ones. How can a good God, a loving God, allow suffering? How can a powerful God not stop suffering? And I'm hearing all these stories from people who've experienced loss or illness or, you know, any number of things and are wrestling with that. If God really loved me, if God was powerful, why did he let this happen? Why did he not stop it? Why has he not fixed it? And what they've come to discover is what Job eventually came to discover, is that God actually knows a lot more than they do. God's actually after a lot more than their comfort or their plans. And God's actually more creative because so many of them are at a place now where they're like, I wouldn't trade it now. Did I enjoy the suffering? Not necessarily, but what I've seen God do, what God's equipped me for now, how I'm able to be more fully an ambassador of Christ, like, man, I would not trade that for a comfortable life. And so I think the question of suffering is a big one, also because we all navigate it. Different levels, right? Mm-hmm. Some of us, it's really robust, intense stuff that everybody would be like, oh yeah, that's suffering. For some of us, it's a unique kind of suffering because it feels like we can't say we're suffering because it's not as bad as suffering as somebody else is suffering. And so then we have to quietly suffer, but we're still suffering, but we diminish it, right? Like, but we all face suffering. And then we have to navigate, why is God not answering my prayers? Why is God not doing what I feel like would be the best case scenario? And this is where that humble introspection comes back in, because then we could say, well, why is it that I'm asking God to do this thing? Is it because I don't want to hurt? That's a fair thing, but pursuing not hurting, maybe that's not the best life goal. And why am I getting mad? Why am I getting mad at God right now? Is it because he's not giving me what I want? Does he actually owe me a single thing? Maybe it's not the best course of action to tell the God of the universe, hey, you need to get your act together and fix my situation, right? Like humble introspection can help us to reposition ourselves.
Yes.
And in that space, we can see suffering differently, because our default is suffering is bad and therefore is to be avoided. If suffering is happening, it's an indicator that something is wrong, something is off. That's what Job's friends said. You're suffering. That means something is wrong with you or something's wrong with God. But actually, nothing was wrong with God. And Job was actually so faithful to God that that's why he was targeted. So those things weren't the issue. Something else was happening, right? And sometimes, I mean, we're broken people living in a broken world. We're not yet in eternity. We're not yet in heaven. So suffering is a part of the package.
Yeah.
But it's possible that we could be like the Apostle Paul, who got to that point where he's imprisoned. He's got wounds all over his body. He has been insulted. He's had close relationships disown him. He's had, I mean, so much suffering, so much suffering. And he's sitting there saying, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. And he's saying, I've learned the secret to being content in any and every situation. Like, this guy's realized, oh, the goal of life isn't to avoid suffering. It's to realize that suffering doesn't have to control me. Suffering doesn't have to overpower me. Suffering does not have to dictate how I see reality. In fact, I could be in the worst of suffering and be content. I could be in the worst of situations and know God's love for me and rejoice. And that's our invitation. And it takes a journey to get there. But man, oh man, the more we get to that place, the less that stuff has control over us. Oh, death, where is your sting? That's what that's talking about.
Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, obviously those are all amazing. You, I don't know if you realize this or not, but I think you listed out 20 very common and very difficult questions, that most of us have. I think any human that's human has at least processed or asked, and maybe not gotten an answer, but has at least asked those questions, whether internally or even externally or to God. But I love, the big, to me, some of the big questions that are also difficult is like, oh, what's the purpose to this life? Or how can I find meaning? And it's so interesting that you use the word contentment, because that's usually typically what I say. But the problem I think often comes is our worldviews shift, and we see contentment as it has to be good. And then we see good as whatever the values are that are in the culture that we have that have been held up. But you take a second look, it's like, is a lot of money good? Like, is sex good? Is fame good? Like, the fact that we've created these things as synonymous, where good and contentment is also then money and all of these things. It's like, no, we can see right now in real time, like, the evils of that. And not to say that money is evil, right? But definitely the love or the lust of money is evil, right? Absolutely, because now, our contentment is going to be in money, and that's a bottomless pit that you will never find. You will never find the end. Just like I'll tell people, it's just like trying to, scroll to the bottom of Instagram. It's just not going to happen. You will not find contentment. You will find continued wanting and more and more and more and more. And then you'll end up feeling more shallow and more shallow and more shallow. But man, how content would you be if you had connection, a true relationship with the God of the universe? And that was your contentment. Then you can have suffering and be content. Then you can have no money and be content. And you can have a lot of money and be content. And you can have, right? It's all these. And so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of go back to the very beginning, to kind of ease it to its close. And I'm just curious personally, what are some of the things that God has led you to do? What are some of the ways in which God has provided for you on this 4-year journey? I, like, just normal, I think, personal, social curiosity. But also I can't imagine that it wouldn't be helpful to hear, oh man, I didn't even think that could be a thing for some of us that are listening, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the money, because that's, I think, what catches people off guard the most, because I had a lot of people coaching me that you need to get a a like you have to get an income.
I
And it's
probably
like,
would have said the same thing.
right. And I would have
Wrongfully, I'm
too.
sure,
But had it not been for a sense from God. So I lost my job on August 2nd, 2018. And I was able to finish out that month. And my boss even said, hey, if you need to use some time to job search, you can. I felt a clear sense from God to not job search in that time. Like a clear, like so clear, like I was like, all right. And then I also felt a clear sense that God was invited. I had been serving at that ministry for over 5 years. So God was inviting me to do a mini sabbatical because it had been in a hard 5 years. And so I felt like I was saying to take the month of September to not job search. All right. Again, I've got a baby on the way, got 2 kids, got a mortgage, got all the things. But it was such a clear sense that I was like, all right, God, I'm going to trust you in that, because God had said, do not fear the financial, do not make decisions out of financial fear. Because here, I mean, let's be honest. Let's just, even if we get practical, let's say I decided, oh no, in order to feed my kids and pay my mortgage, I have to have money. I have to get a job. So I get a job, and we think that solves the problem. That's assuming I can get a job and it's well paying enough and all that kind of stuff. But what we have failed to consider is how little control we have over life, that we all got a very healthy picture of that in 2020, when a lot of people who felt like their plans were secure, their jobs were secure, did not expect a global pandemic. And for a lot of people, things that were a done deal were suddenly not, right? We put so much faith in these things and our logic and how the world works, and fail to realize that, one, the world doesn't always work the way that it wants to work. And 2, God can do the impossible, right? So it's actually safer to choose the foolish thing of God, because God's got a solid track record, rather than to choose the thing that makes sense logically in the world, because a car accident, right? Any number of things could change it, could totally change it. And so I decided to trust God in that. And there's a much longer story. I've got it on my podcast. If anybody wants the full thing, I won't get into it here. But when in that October, I felt like it was time to start looking, but still not out of financial fear, to basically do my due diligence. But I had the sense that God was saying, but what if I have you unemployed for 6 months? Now, in my humanity, I'm thinking people are going to think less of me. People are going to look down on me because I've already lost my job. So who knows what people are thinking of me? Who knows what's being said behind my back? I can't have more added to it, but God's like, I need you to trust me. And so it was a process of honing for me. There were jobs that I applied to, right, that in my mind would have fixed certain things. Like one of them was an executive director job. And I'd been talked down to so much about my supposed lack of leadership that God was like, no, I made you to be a leader. So I want you to apply for this executive director job, right? They ended up pulling that job for different reasons. Nobody got the job at the time. But I realized, that God didn't invite me to apply to that so I get it. He invited me to apply it because I had to take a step of faith to say, no, actually, if God wants me to lead, he will equip me to lead. Another job that was like a fraction of the job I had been doing at the ministry, but paid like $40,000 more, right? My wife and I we would be good financially. We'd be, things would be sustainable. God invited me to apply for that in like some beautiful supernatural ways. Ended up not getting the job for like really just silly reasons. Like it was headhunters. And so they're looking for one specific thing, like a specific denomination. I wasn't a part of that denomination. I'm out, right? But I was like, oh, God didn't want me to do that to get the job. He wanted me to do that so I could see him saying, look, Paul, I could give you a job with lots of money, but I'm not going to, because I want to do something more.
Yeah.
That December, I end up in the hospital unexpectedly for a week. Long story. I was actually fine the entire time I was there. But now I'm like, well, I'm going to have medical bills. Our cat needed dental surgery. We had some car issues. But God was saying, do not fear the financial. My wife was in her 3rd trimester. It was a hard one. And she's like, I just need a manicure or something like that. I need a massage. I don't know. I need something. I'm frugal, so it's hard for me anyways. But when I'm frugal and we only have a few months left in our savings, that would be a way for me to say, no, we can't do that. You know what God told me? He said, whatever your wife needs, let her do that. Do not put any parameters. It's also Christmas time, right? And instead of pulling back and saying, sorry, kids, no gifts this year, like God invited us to not change how we were operating and living. So all of this should have meant that our limited funds would be gone by the end of December. They weren't. We get to the point that they were supposed to be gone, and it's like none of it had disappeared. We had checks come from people that had never given us checks before, that we didn't even ask for, that at times covered the exact amount we needed, right? It's like these things that you hear sometimes we were experiencing. And, like I said at the start, we are in a healthier place financially, where we're not operating at a financial fear. God is meeting our needs. We have never gone without a meal. We have never had to diminish and live in what, I think the myth of missional poverty. If you're doing missions work, you have to be impoverished. No, God can provide. And I think the most beautiful example of this is, and I think this is good for anybody who's asking this question of, God's asking me to leave my job or take a demotion or, have less money. And I don't know how this is going to work because right now we're in the red. So how are we going to? The story of manna is a beautiful one because that story basically is God saying, I know what you need and I know how to provide it. But I also know what you think you need and I know what your desires say. And what I desire is a relationship between us, not just me being a vending machine. And so the parameters that he put in place was that I will always provide manna. But if you get greedy and take more than you need, it's going to rot. Or if you get scared that I might not show up the next day and you take more just to be safe, it's going to rot. But also I'm going to defy my own rules because I don't want you to have to do any work on the Sabbath. So everything extra you gathered that day actually is going to last 2 extra days. It's the only day in which the shelf life is doubled, right? And that's what God's been teaching me, is that I know how the world says money works. I know how I've experienced that money works. And I also have 4 years of experience now, and some other things even before that, but 4 years experience of God saying, hey, watch, you're not going to have a traditional paycheck and I'm going to meet your needs. And sometimes even beyond. There's other stories there. And so I don't even remember what your other question was, but I wanted to start with that one because finance.
The money, is, which obviously, but then, so then what did God call you into in terms of ministry or relationships or community or just random, I got to dig a hole over here. Okay, I'll dig a hole.
Well, and honestly, that's probably been a harder one for me because the other societal norm is you got to climb the ladder, right? So the CEO is highly respected. The person on the back of the garbage truck is not. The person who is hiring people, has people under them, is respected. The person that's unemployed, they're not. And so when God invited me to 6 months of unemployment, I had to navigate. You go to meet someone, what's the first questions are, hey, what's your name and what do you do? We identify people by their jobs. I really came to recognize that when I didn't have that second answer, right? And God was showing me, hey, you don't have to be ashamed. And actually you have a job. You've not lost your job. You're still an ambassador of Christ. So you've still got your job. You got job security, man. What does it look like for you to thrive in that, to celebrate that? But, I'm on the Leaders of Leaders podcast, right? But I'm not Paul Granger, CEO of, or Paul Granger, founder of. And man, there's been so many moments where in my humanity, I could feel shame about that. What do I have to show for myself? Right. But here's what I know. There is this moment so I serve alongside Youth with a Mission, and they do this thing called discipleship training school. It's a whole thing there. But we were doing this exercise of learning what it means to hear from God. And they did a very simple thing of, they invited us to all take a moment to ask God, do you love me? And then to listen and to see what we heard in our mind. And they're like, if it's the enemy, you're going to get a no, oh, no, you're not lovable. If it's your own mind, you'll just come up with whatever. But God does love you. And man, going into that, I was like, is this going to be anything? Is this going to be my own imagination? But too quick, what came in my mind was, well done, my good and faithful servant. So quick, I'm like, I don't think that was me. And what I realized is those were the words that I needed to hear from God, because I had been wrestling with this feeling of how other people were viewing me, of how other people were judging me, that I had nothing to show for myself, that I hadn't produced any of this, that, or the other. But what I knew I was trying to do to the best of my ability is to seek God and to follow him imperfectly, sure. But
Yeah.
I was really trying to do that. And it was in that moment that God was like, well done, my good and faithful servant. I see that, because at the end of the day, God's not going to ask for our list of qualifications and accomplishments, right? Like, he's just going to ask, did you seek me? Did you love me and love others? And in this world, your qualifications seem to matter. If you can prove you have outcomes and that you're providing some service to the world, that seems to matter. But realistically, Apostle Paul says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, and God made it grow. That means there's so many interactions that the Apostle Paul had that he never saw the fruit of, that he could have actually left feeling like he didn't actually have any impact. And he learned to release that, to say, I did my best to seek God in this place, and I'm going to trust it to God. And there were times where fruit did grow, but he never got the credit for it. Apollos did, or others. They never thought. And I'll tell this quick story because it's really relevant. I've been wrestling with this recently. Like, no matter how much healthy theological processing I do around this idea of, it doesn't matter what I show of myself in the world, like, am I seeking God, and God can be honored by that. Like, I still have moments where in my humanity, I think, yeah, but your podcast isn't at 100,000 listeners. So what's the point? Or, what do you have to show for yourself, your years of work? And I mentioned before we started, I couldn't fall asleep till like 2 last night. There's a lot of things in my mind, and I just was feeling low today. And I was driving back, heading home at a time I wouldn't normally, heading in a direction that I wouldn't necessarily have gone. And I was turning the corner when I heard somebody yell out my name. And I look, and there's a young lady standing on the corner. And immediately I knew who she was, and I pulled into this lot that just happened to be there. This is a young lady that I haven't seen in person in maybe 12 years, maybe more. I'm not even sure. And this was back when I worked at the Salvation Army Boys and Girls Club as a teen director. And she wasn't even there the whole time. She was there for like the summers, but she remembered me. And one of the things that she said was, whenever I think of good mentors, I think of you and your wife. And I share that not to toot my own horn or anything like that, but like, I didn't know if she would even necessarily remember me.
Yeah.
And definitely, I didn't know I had any kind of an impact. But we've heard these stories so often, right? Of like, years down the line, somebody says, hey, that thing you said really was meaningful to me. And the person's like, I didn't even remember saying that, right? Like, we have no idea the ways that God can work through us, the seeds that he can actually grow fruit from. And if we allow our minds to have a metric of success based on accomplishment, we may miss the beautiful garden that God is making thrive. But if we're willing to say, all right, God, to the best of my ability, I sought you in this situation, and here I am, and I'm going to keep on walking. Man, like, God can do so much through that. But are we willing to wait till eternity to be able to see the fruit of that? Like, are we willing to release the acclaim and accomplishment now? If we are, God can bring a contentment in place of whatever we think accomplishment will give us.
I love it. That's a beautiful place to finish. Well, if people are looking to get some advice or listen to your incredible stories or learn from some of the stuff that we've learned today on the Leaders of Leaders podcast, which, by the way, the leader of leaders is Jesus Christ. So
Yep.
If you're an ambassador of Christ, that's why you're on the Leaders and Leaders podcast right there.
Yep.
But yeah, so how can people get a hold of you? How can they get a hold of your podcast? Yeah, where can they find?
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the start, there's Ephesians 4, I think, talks about, to some, they were given to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. So shepherd, pastoral care, that's where I find myself falling heavily. And what that can look like practically is, I just feel like God's invited me to create space to process him. And so one of the spaces that, if somebody is just trying to process God, the church, these hard questions, www.wheredidyousseegod.com is where I'm trying to collect these things that I've written, things that I've recorded, the podcast itself. Because the truth is that we're all trying to navigate this life. We're all trying to figure it out. We're all trying to take steps in the direction that makes the most sense to us. And if we're trying to step towards Jesus, the more that we step together, the more that we're actually going to step in the right direction. Because when you look in scripture, a lot of things that we interpret as a singular you is actually plural. So I want to journey together with people. You and I are journeying together right now as we're processing these things. The podcast exists for that to be the case too, whether someone's a guest or listening. So wheredidyousseegod.com, that's the place to go. And if anybody wants to connect with me, I'm always happy to have conversations.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Paul, for sharing such an awesome perspective and such an atypical, at least in the US, maybe even in the world. And thank you so much for
My pleasure.
being willing to walk that out. Yeah.
Yeah.